All right, everyone. Hello. Welcome to our final lecture of the course. Made it on the presidency. I apologize. Usually, when I teach this course, I have our department's expert on the presidency, Matt Beckman, do this lecture, but Beckman is on sabbatical this year, so he is not around. But if you are interested in the presidency, I strongly recommend you take his courses. He teaches multiple classes on the presidency. He's a wealth of knowledge and a terrific person. So we're going to talk about the presidency today. I won't be able to give you as much detail as Beckman could, but I will be able to go over a few things. One, we're going to talk about the president's role, what the founders expected from the president, and how that's evolved over time. From what's called chief clerk, where the president was basically, the president is designed as the head of the executive branch. Remember, we have judicial, who interprets the laws, we have legislative, who makes the laws, and we have executive, who enforces the law. And the president was the head of the executive branch and is seen as kind of at the beginning as a chief administrator or clerk. Not this expansive, super powerful role in every aspect of political life, basically, that the president has assumed over time. And so we'll talk about how this has changed, why more and more power has become vested in the executive branch. And this follows a similar trajectory, if you remember, from when we were doing federalism, talking about the expansion of national power. Well, the analog or the similarity there is between the expansion of executive power, or the power of the presidency. But let's go back to where it begins with the framers and the presidency. Remember, we're coming out, if we go back to the very beginning of this class, we're coming out of the revolution, we're coming out of King George III being seen as tyrannical and having too much power invested in a monarch or a king. And so the framers wanted to design the presidency to allow for quick and concerted actions during times of national crisis. Remember also that if we go back to the beginning of the course and we think about the Articles of Confederation, Articles of Confederation made it very difficult to deal with a national crisis or a local crisis in the case of Shays' Rebellion. And the Articles of Confederation didn't have an executive, didn't have a unified source of power that can act quickly and decisively in times of crisis. And so the framers realized that that was a big deficiency in the Articles of Confederation and wanted to vest more power into the executive or into the presidency, particularly in times of crisis. And then it was assumed that power that they accumulated during crisis time would recede when the crisis was over. In reality, what we've seen, and what we'll talk about more later on in this lecture, is that crises present opportunities for carving out executive power, and that once that executive power gets carved out, it's hard to put that genie back into the bottle. And also the framers rejected the idea of a plural executive or multiple executive. They wanted a unitary executive, one that could act unitarily in times of crisis. Okay, so what are the president's duties and authorities? Remember, the president is Article 2 of the Constitution. Legislative branch or Congress is outlined in Article 1, and judiciary is outlined in Article 3. Article 2 sets out some of the president's chief powers. That first and foremost, commander-in-chief of the military. The president is the head of our armed forces. One of the reasons why when the president walks to Marine One, his helicopter, and there's the dude there saluting him because he is the head of the military. Also serves a role as chief diplomat. We'll talk about that more, the president's role in negotiating treaties, and more commonly in recent years in negotiating executive agreements with other nations. As we mentioned, the president is the chief executive. He is the head of the executive branch. In the executive branch, we have the presidency, and we'll go over this later in class, but we have tons of other cabinet positions under him. And so the State Department and the Justice Department and the Treasury Department and the Department of Homeland Security, these all report up to the president. And that's why the president can appoint members of cabinet, and the president can also fire those members of the cabinet. And so when Trump was president, he would frequently hire and fire new members of the cabinet and would typically fire them via tweet. And the president also has a role as a legislator. In the Constitution, we'll talk about one of the president's only main roles as outlined by the Constitution is that of the veto. And we'll talk about the veto in a little bit more in a second. But over time, the president has emerged as a major source of legislation. Constitutional powers are ambiguous and limited, yet president is considered quite powerful. One of the reasons that the power of the presidency has evolved and the president has become increasingly powerful is that the authority from the president or the executive is derived from the public. The president is the one elected official who has a national constituency, has to report to all the people, as in contrast with members of Congress or governors or senators who all have more local constituencies. Okay, so the president as commander-in-chief. The Constitution says the president is commander-in-chief of the nation's armed forces. This gives the president broad license over military matters. The founders had some difficulty giving one individual control of the military for good reason. Again, we're coming out of the revolution, and the founders are very concerned with concentrated military power in one person. And so they want to make sure that, yes, the president is the head of the military. The president does have broad license over military matters, but the check that the founders wanted to have over the president's ability in matters of war and peace was that only Congress can declare war. And so over time, this has become hollowed out, but we'll talk about that a little bit more later. But the founders' intent was, yes, if there is a need to act quickly and decisively, the president can order troops to go in somewhere, et cetera, but if it comes down to serious engagement where we're going full-scale war, only Congress should be able to declare war. Presidents, however, do have this first mover advantage. A first mover advantage means if the president, for instance, has intelligence that there are terrorists in Syria, the president then can go and say, I'm going to order airstrikes on Syria as a first mover. And it's very hard for Congress or for anyone to check that power. Okay, next up is the president's role as head of state. The president has broad authority to transact diplomatic affairs. This is what we mean earlier on. We talk about the president as the chief diplomat. President represents the country in diplomatic affairs, typically in negotiations with other nations. And this also happens through other members of the executive branch who report to the president. And so in diplomatic affairs, this usually means the State Department or the Secretary of State. Sometimes the Defense Department, Secretary of Defense will get involved if they are matters of nuclear weapons, for instance. Then the Energy Department might get involved. But these are all people who work together with the president. And so the president is the face of the United States in our interactions with other nations. Now, the most important limitation on the president's role in diplomatic matters is that a 2/3 majority of the Senate has to ratify treaties. And so the president has the authority to negotiate treaties with other nations, but the Senate then has to ratify that treaty by a 2/3 majority. And so a classic example of this is in World War I, after we negotiated a peace treaty, Woodrow Wilson gets all amped up and behind the idea of a League of Nations. This was the predecessor to what we have now as the United Nations. Wilson goes all around the country, tries to sell it, then he gets a stroke and gets out of commission for a while, and ultimately the Senate rejects it. We never joined the League of Nations. The League of Nations turns out to be basically nothing without us, and then we end up in World War II. Not a direct corollary, but that did happen. But it's not as limiting a check today due to the use of executive agreements. Executive agreements are now basically everything in terms of the president's interaction or the president's negotiation with other countries. And so we don't have treaties, but we do have executive agreements. I'll tell you the difference between those in just a second. But one of the problems is that our Congress or our Senate is so deeply polarized now that basically nothing that the president wants to do would have 2/3 of the Senate behind him, because that would require substantial support from the other side. And in our polarized Congress, as you learned last week, that's just really hard to do. But the president can still go ahead and do these executive agreements. And so unlike in a treaty, an executive agreement cannot supersede U.S. law, remains in force as long as the parties find their interests well served. It's a mainstay of foreign relations. And so a couple examples of executive agreements in recent years were the Paris Climate Accord. So Obama gets together with a bunch of other nations. They hammer out this Paris Climate Accord that sets carbon emission standards going forward. But the problem with an executive agreement, unlike a treaty, is that it's very easy to overturn. And so treaty's hard. You get 2/3 of members of the Senate. That it kind of sticks in place. But executive agreement comes in. Obama says, all right, I want us to do this Paris Climate Accord. And then Trump gets into office and it was like, no, I think this Paris and Climate Accord is shit. We're out. And then, so we withdraw. And then what happens? Well, Biden comes into office and he says, no, this Paris Climate Accord was a good deal. We're getting back in. And so that's the nature of executive agreements. On the one hand, they're very easy to engage with, but they're also very easy to get out of. And so two examples of this from Obama and Trump era, one is the Paris Climate Accord, the other is the Iran nuclear deal that specified conditions where Iran would not develop a nuclear weapon in response for decreased sanctions. Trump withdrew us from that. The Biden team is now re-engaging in talks with Iran. Okay, What is the president's role as a legislature? The Constitution gives presidents only a modest role in the legislative arena. One is they may call Congress into special sessions, so you see this every now and then. We saw Biden do this in April when he called in a special session of Congress, joint session, to talk about his proposals, talk about the basic State of the Union. The most important one by far that the president has, and this is specific to the Constitution, is the veto. And so if you remember from Congress, Congress passes the law, has to pass both houses of Congress in identical wording. And then after it gets passed in the House and in the Senate, it then goes to the president. And the president can sign it, or the president can veto it. And if the president vetoes it, it does not become law unless there are 2/3 of the House and the Senate who are then able to override his veto. But in practice, vetoes are almost never overridden. And so the ability to veto laws becomes really important because you have to have the president and you have to have Congress on the same page in order to get anything done in terms of passing laws. The other one is the president must report from time to time to Congress with State of the Union address. And so early on, this was just done through written. Basically, it wasn't a big deal. The president would just report on the State of the Union, give a written address to Congress, and that would be the end of it. Now it happens at the end of January. And it happens every year, and the president basically uses that as a big opportunity to address Congress and to address the people, to put forth his priorities, to talk about what's been happening in the country and where he wants to go. This here is what the number of vetoes looks like over time. And what you can see is, in the 70s, this is an era of divided government. They become pretty strong, and they've really petered out over time. One of the reasons why we don't see much vetoing anymore is because typically you only go through the motions of passing legislation if you know that the president is on board with such legislation. Another thing that the president does are first-year requests for legislation. And so this is happening right now. The president typically introduces new legislation during his first year, or during his first term. Biden right now is championing a big multi-trillion-dollar infrastructure plan after he targeted a big multi-trillion-dollar COVID-19 relief practice. Increasing use of signing statements. You don't need to know about signing statements. We won't go over them. Veto game. So we'll talk a little bit more about vetoes. When will a president exercise a presidential veto? How is veto different from signing statement? You don't need to know this. This would be questions that we would typically ask if we were in person. So we will go on with that. But the veto is definitely something important, definitely something you need to know for the final. The president's threat of veto gives him a ton of power in the legislative realm. It's also the president gives the president the opportunity to introduce legislation, knowing that if you're not going to roll with the president, he is likely going to veto your action. All right, where we want to go with this second half of the lecture is the expansion of presidential power. I teased it at the beginning of the lecture that this expansion of presidential power over time has become quite significant. When the framers were designing the Constitution, they envisioned the legislative branch, or Congress, to be the most powerful of the three branches. But over time, the executive branch, particularly the president has become the most powerful of the three branches. And so, as I mentioned at the beginning of class, the president as a chief clerk, that basically meant that the president was thought of as an administrator, not much beyond the role of administering, enforcing the laws as such. So 19th century presidential powers. What did presidential power look like in the 1800s? Early presidents assert constitutional power over foreign affairs. That was pretty much their main realm. Stayed out of legislative affairs for the most part, but were quite active in foreign affairs, negotiating treaties, recognizing diplomats in nations, etc. President has virtually no role during this time over domestic policy. The president was not involved in legislation, and majority of time spent filling bureaucratic positions. The whole executive branch of the government is filled with bureaucratic positions, basically lower level people. And so again, we'll go over the flow chart later on in the lecture of how each branch of government, or how each cabinet, or how each agency relates to the president. But the president during these times is fulfilling the role of clerk, appointing people to bureaucratic positions based in large part on patronage. Patronage means doing favors to people who have done favors for me or for my party. And we still have patronage involved to some degree in executive appointments, but that's been curbed much through civil service protections, or through the idea that people are appointed to a lot of positions or hired for positions and protected from political whims. All right, so the cabinet presidency. Under the president, we have a cabinet, and the cabinet are the heads of all of these executive agencies. So in the cabinet, we have Secretary of Defense, who runs the Defense Department, or who runs the Pentagon. And then we have Homeland Security and Treasury and Education and Agriculture and Housing and Urban Development, and all of these agencies. And the president is the one who appoints members of the cabinet. These secretaries or members of the cabinet do have to be approved by a majority in the Senate. So the president reserves appointments of key positions for himself. However, his cabinet members have a good deal of autonomy. And so this is an inherent tension also between cabinet secretaries who want to exert autonomy in this case, meaning I want to run the Defense Department the way I want to run the Defense Department. Or I want to run the State Department the way I want to run the State Department. I don't want the president meddling in my business. And so this can oftentimes create tension between presidents and the cabinet secretary. And for example, if there were these tensions going on between cabinet secretaries and Trump would typically fire them. And so one good example of this was the Justice Department. President Trump wanted his first Attorney General, Jeff Sessions, to fire Robert Mueller and to use the Justice Department to investigate his political enemies. And Sessions didn't want to do this, and so he ends up firing him. But that tends to be the nature of cabinets. Usually it's more collaborative and collegial, but Trump is a unique case. Partnership based upon reciprocity rather than power. Basically what that means is what I was just saying, is that it's usually more collaborative. You have give and take from the president and from cabinet secretaries. Congress uncertain about presidential prerogative in firing cabinet secretaries, and so basically what the conventional wisdom has come to be is that cabinet secretaries or head of cabinet departments serve at the pleasure of the president. The president can hire and fire however you want. And so what would happen was Trump would fire all of these people, but then he wouldn't be able to appoint new ones who needed to be approved by the Senate. And so we ended up, by the end of Trump's term, having all of these acting Secretary of Defense, acting Attorney General, acting Homeland Security. I think we had like 3 different acting Homeland Security secretaries. Okay. Party allegiance during this role plays an important role in limiting the president's power to that of chief clerk. And so in the 19th century, in the 1800s, political parties exert tremendous control over the 19th century president. And so one of the things that happened back in the day is that we moved from the presidency being a party-dominated institution to what we have today, where the presidency is a candidate-dominated institution. The president back then was kind of subservient to the party. Now the party is very much subservient to the president. The president is the head of his party. Again, Donald Trump is a good example here. Donald Trump comes in, does kind of a hostile takeover of the Republican Party. They didn't want him, but because Trump has the constituency or has the voters on his side, and because we've moved to a candidate-centered version of the presidency, Trump remains really in complete and total control of the Republican Party. Okay, and so the big difference, though, is through how the president gets nominated. Back in the day, if the president was going to be on the ballot, the president needed his party. The only way that you could represent the party as the president in a general election campaign is to get the party's nomination. And the parties themselves, or the party leaders, the party bosses, were the ones who were in control of the nominating process. Now, as we talked a little bit about in campaigns, we have these presidential primaries where the voters directly decide who represents the party in presidential elections. And so that shifts the power. And so the party may not want Donald Trump. And so party leaders in 2016 definitely didn't want Donald Trump. But the voters, Republican voters, loved this dude. And so that gave him his power. His power is more derived from the people. But back in the day, it was all about the parties. And so the parties controlled the nomination. They would select according to someone who had widespread appeal in the party. They would also only choose party loyalists, somebody with deep ties to the party, who you know is going to act in best interest of the party. Again, Trump is unique in this case. Trump would never have been a nominee for a party in the 19th century or in the early 20th century, so long as party leaders were the ones who controlled the nomination. And so willingness to comply and deal with Congress, these were all things that the party bosses looked for in selecting who the president was. And the party in power wanted to maintain power and also use their patronage. So it's a major party-focused system, and we'll talk about why that comes to an end with the expansion of presidential power. And so for the rest of this lecture, we're going to go over these different factors leading to the expansion of presidential power. We'll talk about opportunity and necessity, talk about presidential assertions of power, expansion of modern media, that gets into our lecture a couple weeks ago, candidate selection, which I was just talking about, and presidential professionalization, or the huge professional apparatus that now surrounds the White House and the executive office of the presidency. Okay, so opportunity or catastrophe, this again has similarities to our discussions of the catastrophic opportunistic events, depending on what side you're looking at. that expanded national power at expense of the states. And so situations in American politics can demand expansion of presidential power, of course. Lincoln was a great abuser of executive power, and so, of course, there were a ton of good things that Lincoln did, often recognized as the greatest president in American history. But he was assuming very strong, almost dictatorial type powers during the Civil War, would suspend the rights of accused if those individuals were thought to be helping the Confederate States or to be helping the South. FDR expands government role in economic and labor power. And so, again, we see, because of the Great Depression under FDR has two of the biggest crises in American history during his long tenure as president. He takes over the presidency in 1933 in the midst of the Great Depression, and he has to exert a lot more executive power in economic and labor policy in order to try to get the economy back on track. And so this is absolutely something that is carried through with us in times of economic crises. In the last 12 years or last 13 years, we've had two catastrophic economic events. One was the Great Recession in 2008, sparked by the financial collapse, and the Treasury Department under George W. Bush, the executive branch, Treasury Secretary of the time, Hank Paulson, steps in, uses monetary policy to really save the country in a lot of ways from going over, save the banks from all defaulting on their loan. Likewise, in 2020, during the coronavirus recession, we see the Federal Reserve, another part of the executive branch of government, come in and really help out the economy through lending policy. And then also FDR, of course, has World War II near the end of his tenure in the White House. And one of the things he does during this time is very disgraceful executive order. This is an okay executive order. This one is the Lend-Lease program that really helps out the UK, but he also does an executive order that calls for the internment of Japanese Americans. A true disgraceful episode. George W. Bush expands from 9/11. George W. Bush, we create the Department of Homeland Security, which is the largest government agency, the largest of the government, the cabinet departments. We create that very shortly after the 9/11 attack. Okay, so necessity, congressional need to delegate administrative oversight. And so one of the things that's happened is that as the bureaucracy grows, as these executive departments become increasingly big to meet the moment, to meet the crises, whether they're economic or military, Congress must delegate to the president. And so Congress can't keep up with the need to legislate and continue daily oversight over the bureaucracy. It is Congress's formal role to have oversight of these executive agencies, to have oversight over the bureaucracy. The Congress is the one who supplies or who authorizes their budget, but it's impossible to do it, and so they end up delegating authority to the president. This is what we mean by necessity. Congress can't possibly do it all, so they delegate authority to the president. The president is basically the one who now oversees the extent of the bureaucracy. And so the dangers of this is they lose control over important implementation decisions, vesting more and more power into the executive branch. The benefits is that it provides vague goals for implementation and let bureaucracy and the presidency take political heat for decisions. This this has become a major reason that the president has become so powerful, is that a lot of issues Congress just doesn't want to get involved because it's too politically kind of it's a hot stove issue, and so you don't want to touch it, and so you defer to somebody else. We'll kind of sit back, let's let the president deal with it, he can take the heat. All right, so necessity, congressional lead to oversight, blah, 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 appointment, budgeting, Congress must delegate budget authority, and so this budget authority becomes a huge reason for expansion also. So if you just saw recently, the Biden administration put out their first proposed budget, and so the president now is the one who initiates the budget. Budget becomes political bargaining tool and strengthens the presidential bargaining position over legislative decisions. And so the president puts forth a large budget, and then Congress often works within that framework. Okay, institutional changes also enhance the presidential power, expanding executive branch. Growing executive administration empowers the president as the chief executive. Presidents use appointment powers, executive reorganization, and executive orders to affect policy through executive action. We'll talk about executive orders in just a second. But this is one aspect of the president. This is really expanded over time, this executive office of the presidency. More and more staff put under the president's control. And so the executive office of the president, this also, they do not need to be confirmed by the Senate. The president really can appoint whoever he wants to these positions. And so we have the president, and under him, the White House staff. This would be chief of staff. In Biden's case, that would be Ron Klain, and then a lot of people there. And then under them are the executive office of the presidency. And these are just, these are offices that have been increasingly added over time. And so you have things like Office of Management and Budget. This actually does need to be confirmed by the Senate, but don't worry about that. Office of Management and Budget are the ones who put out the budget. Council of Economic Advisors, National Security Council is quite important. Office of National Drug Control Policy, Office of U.S. Trade, blah, 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 blah. And so all of these people work under the president and kind of help. The president, see now, is basically called on to do everything. When we think of a national problem, how is the president going to handle it? And so if it's an economic problem, we got to call in the Council of Economic Advisors. If it's a national security problem, we call in the National Security Council, et cetera, et cetera. This is what the cabinet looks like. And so the president has the cabinet. These are typically the four most important ones: Department of Justice, Department of Defense, Department of State, and Department of Treasury. But all of these individuals the president appoints as the secretary. These individuals then need to be confirmed by a majority vote in the Senate. And so all of this helps make the government run. And the president is in charge of it all. And through the president's use of budgets and appointments, the president can have a really, really big effect on policy. And so, for example, if we look at kind of differences between how presidents do things, so for the Department of Education, for example, Donald Trump doesn't want, or Republican politics do not want large federal involvement in education. They want it to be left up to the states. They don't even often believe in public education and think that you should have vouchers to be able to use that in private schools. And so Donald Trump appoints Betsy DeVos to head the Department of Education. And she, in turn, goes about weakening the federal government's role in education. And these happen regardless. So something like the Department of Labor. The Democratic Party typically sides more on the side of unions. The Republican Party typically sides more on the side of big business. The Democratic Party wants more regulation over big business. The Republican Party wants less regulation over big business. And so who we decide to appoint as the head of the Department of Labor as secretary, that can have a big influence on policy. One thing in the Department of Homeland Security, how the president and the Homeland Security Secretary instruct ICE to deal with immigrations, customs, and enforcement differs very dramatically based upon our last two recent presidents. Whereas President Trump is going to instruct the Department of Homeland Security to be all in on raids and deportations and such, and the President Biden less so. And so the president's ability to appoint cabinet members, and then those cabinet members' ability to set the policy of their various departments has a huge influence on policy and on governance. Okay, presidential assertions of powers. Oh, this is also a very important one in terms of agency budgets. And so, like, one of the things that for agency budgets, who you prioritize in your agencies as the president has a really big, important role. And so Trump, for instance, prioritized the Department of Defense and Homeland Security. Big budget increases proposed for them. But he really, really, really wanted to slash the State Department's budget. And so this is kind of hard versus soft foreign power, foreign policy power. Soft power means diplomatic, means we're going to entrust the diplomats at the Department of State, and hopefully they'll be able to establish good relations to the point where we do not need to use hard power in military matters. Trump was more on the side of let's build up a really, really big army so nobody messes with us. So the presidential assertions of power, these agency budgets are really important. And so who are you going to empower through resources? President gets to set the agenda, at least in terms of what he thinks these agencies should be getting. Executive orders, super duper important in recent years. As our politics becomes increasingly polarized, and we talked about this in Congress, becomes increasingly difficult to pass major legislation. Let's say that we wanted to pass a law that protected the Dreamers. The DREAM Act is a policy that has a lot of support, but that Congress can't get behind for various reasons. But what the president can do through executive orders, and President Obama did this with the DACA, or the Deferred Action on Childhood Arrivals, was say that I'm going to instruct Homeland Security not to deport any, and that's the deferred action, on people who were brought to this country as children. And so that's the Deferred Action on Childhood Arrivals. DACA, it's an executive order. And so President Obama was basically able to make this important change in immigration policy through the DACA. He also did the DAPA, which is the Deferred Action on Parents of Americans. So if your parent was undocumented, but you were born in the U.S., Obama instructed federal agencies not to deport such individuals. The issue with executive orders in that case, though, is that the next president can just come in and with a stroke of his pen change it again. And so Obama puts through the DACA, and then President Trump signs an executive order saying, no, we are going to end the DACA. And so executive orders have become super duper important tools to presidential power. And so if you remember, on January 21st, Biden's first full day in office, he signed a ton of executive orders, and a lot of them were just reversing things that Trump had done, or to reverse Trump's reversals of things that he'd come in and changed from Obama. Agency budgets we just mentioned, and then executive agreements, these agreements with other foreign nations. The White House is also now really the central clearance for legislative. And so what that means is that legislation often starts within the White House. The White House is the one who puts the proposal out there. And so you're hearing this now when you talk about Biden's infrastructure proposal. And so the Biden administration, if it's infrastructure, they'll work with the Department of Transportation, and they'll put together their own legislation. One of the issues, again, for the Trump administration is that they didn't really have their act together in terms of central clearance for putting together legislative proposals. So one of the first steps that the Trump administration takes legislatively is to try to repeal and replace Obamacare. And what happened was that they never really put together a proposal. And so typically what would happen is the White House would work together with the Cabinet Department, in this case would be the Health and Human Affairs Department, and they would hammer out a legislative proposal. But the Trump administration was never able to really do this, and so Congress had to start it, and that was always problematic. But the ability to kind of initiate legislation is really important. And then the last one is budget control. President proposes the budget. In that budget, he sets out priorities. Those priorities then have a really important role in governance. This here is the big increase of executive orders. This graph ends here in the late 90s. If we were to extend it even further, though, it would start out, boom. And this is a natural tendency of what's happened with our polarized Congress. As it becomes more and more difficult to pass laws in Congress, pass laws through the legislative branch, the president then takes it on his own to set policy through executive orders. There are limitations to that. The president can't just say, I'm going to issue an executive order that, I don't know, gives you all $1 million. That cannot happen. But the president, through his control of executive agencies, and so the president can issue an executive order saying, I'm going to tell Department of Homeland Security, here's how I think you should be running immigration policy, for example. And then that, in turn, has a big effect. Okay, institutional presidency, expansion of the presidential bureaucracy. And so this was, we saw earlier, this expansion of all of those different offices under the White House. So information and governing demands force, expansion of presidential staff and organization. Basically, as governing has become more and more complex, as problems over time has become more and more complex, as you know, the founders weren't envisioning an executive department that needed NASA, because we weren't doing space travel at the time. But as those things come into play, more and more government agencies get added to deal with our increasingly complex problems of the day. So information and governing, so we have the executive offices of the president, we have the OMB, the Office of Management and Budget, for example. They produce an annual budget, they monitor agency performance, there's central clearance. National Security Council compiles reports and advice from the State Defense Department and Joint Chief of Staff. Basically, everything is a big funnel in the White House, and that it funnels up to the president. The president is at the top, and then all of these other people below him to make government run in an important way. Okay, expanding White House staff. The White House staff increased from fewer than 50 in the 1930s to over 500 in contemporary White Houses. Organizational elaboration within the White House, increased specialization and expertise in the presidency. This is federal budget, you don't need to look at that. Last one we want to talk about are expansion of mass media and changes in campaign. And this harkens back to a couple of the recent lectures we did on changing media environment, changing campaign environment. And so with the expansion of the mass media, the president assumes natural position as figurehead for the government. And this is where we get the case where the president basically gets blamed for anything that goes wrong in the country. And this has to do in part with the fact that the president is the face of the government, and the media is going to be focusing on, hey, why isn't the president dealing with such and such an issue? Direct communication to voters becomes much easier. And so we talked about this with media and Trump. Trump's rise is impossible without the media. The media, social media and cable news media focusing in on Trump gives him power because it allows him to take his message directly to voters, to bypass party leaders, party elites who don't like him, who don't want him to be the face of the Republican Party. And media coverage prefers charismatic leaders rather than technicians. And so what do we get? And this is a good example between Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump. Hillary Clinton was a technician. She was somebody who, liked the business of legislation, was a policy wonk, liked to get into the details. But Trump is this bigger than life personality with no experience doing anything. And media coverage is going to prefer the charismatic leader and give them a sense of power. Campaign changes also have huge impact on presidential powers. So from King Caucus to presidential primaries, King Caucus was the system we were talking about earlier, where party leaders got to decide who would represent their party in presidential election. And so permits for direct election of presidential candidates, that is super important. You could be hated by members of the party, by the party elite, as Trump was in 2016. But Trump does not derive his power, or the president does not derive his power increasingly from the party, but he derives his power from the people. And that the party then works to serve the interests of the president rather than the president serving the interests of the party, as happened back in the day. And so this means from party to candidate-centered elections. And so back in the day, we had party-centered elections where the candidates were subservient to the party. Now we have candidate-centered elections where the candidate kind of dictates the situation and then the party works to help him. Campaign shift leads to power shifts, mandates and public opinion, going public and constant election cycles. This going public means that the president is always wanting to be out in front of the public, selling his priorities, trying to get public opinion on board for his policies to get a mandate to get Congress to act. What we've seen also is the president become increasingly visible because the president derives his authority through media, through popularity. The president always wants to be out there trying to communicate to the people. And then finally, the growth of unitary executive. So unitary executive theory, the president is vested with broad powers, independent from Congress. We don't need to do signing statements. We got rid of those. The last thing we want to talk about, though, is are we headed towards an imperial presidency? Imperial presidency is a term that's often thrown around derogatorily. What imperial presidency means is that the president has so much power now that he is essentially unchecked in his ability to to govern, but also unchecked in his ability to, create mischief. The president is unchecked in his ability to use his power, not necessarily in the public's good, but in his own political aggrandizement or his own for his own political power. So again, a lot of people were concerned with that in the Trump era. One video I was thinking of showing you this week was called The Imperial Presidency in the Trump Era, but I decided to scrap that because you've done enough. You've got through this quarter. It was a tough quarter, but I appreciate you sticking it out. I appreciate you watching hour-long videos from me and my colleagues, and I hope to see you soon in person. Bye, everybody.